Thank you so much, President Bramley, for having me here today and for that introduction. What you didn't hear in that introduction or in my bio in the brochure is that I love food. I'm a foodie. I love to shop for food, especially at farmers markets. And it stands. The smells and the colors, they intoxicate me. A cantaloupe in summer with the sweet aroma, picking strawberries and eating them before they turn to mush. And fresh ripened tomatoes with just a bit of sea salt and maybe some basil leaves. I spend much of my weekend cooking for the week, and in summer, with my constant arrival of my CSA share, I am canning and freezing and now even dehydrating for a good part of 4 months out of the year. I'm not really a religious person, but I do consider myself a spiritual one. For me, though, I haven't found it in a house of worship, but rather on a farm, which is surprising because I grew up in a suburb. The braided onions hanging from the vegetable stand, the heirloom tomatoes in various shapes and colors, with all their imperfections, the bouquets of sunflowers and nasturtiums. For me, it's always bursting with life. I belong to several CSAs and co-ops in order to source my food locally as much as I can. Mostly because I like knowing that the food I buy is fresh and that I'm supporting my local economy. But while my buying practices are predominantly local, I know they never can be entirely. Let's face it, I'm not giving up that cup of coffee in the morning, my tea, or my daily banana. And we don't grow any of those crops in the north. That's why it's important for us to all understand that while we can and should support local and regional food systems, we're also part of a global food system. And that food system needs major reforms. Millions of small farmers and laborers depend on those living in the developed world to drink that cup of coffee or that cup of tea or eat that daily banana that they grew. And with nearly 1 billion people, or 1 in 7, estimated as being undernourished, our food system isn't making the cut. 75% of the world's poorest live in rural areas. Decent work is not the norm, with an alarming rate of child labor in agriculture, a high frequency of precarious work, as wage workers are mostly temporary or seasonal, with limited social or legal protections, exposure to adverse working conditions due to poor labor standards, and little or no unionization. What we need to focus on is how that food is being grown. How are people being paid to grow the food? What are the working or purchasing conditions under which the food was grown? And of course, the environment. With so many people involved in a global food system, if we don't make it socially and environmentally sustainable, we won't be able to feed the 9 billion people that will be here in 2050. Ironically, those that work in the food system are often the most food insecure. Here in the United States, over 20 million people work in our food supply industry. That accounts for 1 in 5 workers in the private sector and 1 in 6 out of all US workers. A new report out by the Food Chain Workers Alliance found that 86% of food workers surveyed reported earning low to poverty level wages. And as is the case globally, food workers here at home face higher levels of food insecurity than the rest of the workforce as well. In fact, they use food stamps at twice the rate of other workers in the United States. This report also found that 79% of workers in the food supply chain do not have paid sick days, or didn't even know if they had them. And 83% do not receive health benefits from their employer, and 58% don't have any health coverage at all. According to the Food Chain Workers Alliance, 23% of grocery workers were paid less than the minimum wage. The Restaurant Opportunity Center found that 10.1 million workers are employed by the restaurant industry, which has some of the lowest wages and occurrences of wage theft. And the median wage in that industry is only $8.89, which means that over half of restaurant workers earn below the federal poverty line for a family of 3. Farm workers, in particular, are vulnerable because they are excluded from many of the protections that other workers benefit from in the U.S. For example, agricultural workers are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, so they have no right to collectively bargain under federal law as other workers do. They're also exempt from many of the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, including overtime provisions. Most states exclude agricultural workers from the requirement of employers to provide workmen's compensation insurance, despite the fact that farm workers have a high incidence of occupational injury and illness. Agricultural work, after all, is some of the most hazardous occupations in the United States. According to the Inventory of Farm Worker Issues and Protections in the United States, in 2009, the occupational fatality rate for farm workers was 5 times the rate of average workers. And yet, in the same period, less than half of U.S. farm workers were covered by workmen's comp insurance. Bottom line, there are at least 1.4 million farm workers in this country, and 3 out of their 5 families live in poverty. For my CSA, we are required to do some voluntary hours on the farm. Last summer, we did a field for about an hour and a half, and I consider myself in decent shape and do a lot of gardening, but this was different. Farm work is tough. It's repetitive, and it puts you in awkward positions for long periods of time, so it is no wonder that not many Americans are flocking to these jobs. During last year's harvest, by the way, this is a picture of the showers. It's hard to see, but those are the drains in the showers, which many farm workers go into at the same time. They're not private. And this is at a labor camp in North Carolina with one of Oxfam's partners, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. As I was saying, during last year's harvest season, there were a number of articles, including a New York Times piece about the labor shortage in agriculture. You might wonder how there's a labor shortage with so many unemployed workers in our economy right now. Well, the reason farmers can't just go out and hire unemployed local workers is because the work is just too hard for the amount of money that's being paid. An article in the Atlantic Journal-Constitution cited a report that Georgia's economy is likely to lose $391 million and lose 3,260 jobs because of farm labor shortages. While the report didn't discuss the reason for the shortage, the farmers were blaming Georgia's anti-immigrant law on the outcome. Reality is that many farmers rely on undocumented workers for their labor. With states passing laws that essentially hunt down undocumented immigrants, farmers are losing out on their cheap labor. One way to begin our broken food system here in Congress is to pass ag jobs, a bipartisan bill that was negotiated by the United Farm Workers and agricultural employees. Both growers and farm worker unions support ag jobs, so why hasn't it gotten done? Immigration reform, as we know, is a very hot-button issue in American politics, one that neither Republicans nor Democrats want to touch. And as the Republican presidential debates have shown, anyone supporting anything that benefits migrants is demonized. Instead, growers are now proposing reforms to the H-2A guest worker program, which would strip the few protections in place for farm workers. But laws aren't enough to change our food system. If we want to continue enjoying fresh produce from American farms, then we need a stable labor force that is protected and receives livable wages for work that most of us, frankly, refuse to do. Recently, I attended the Sustainable Food Lab conference in the Dominican Republic. My good friends at the Sustainable Food Lab, which is based here in Vermont, work with some of the largest food companies in the world to make the food system more sustainable. On the last day of the conference, about 10 tables were set up with topics placed at each table. Topics ranged from smallholders to the environment, certifications, metrics. And one of those tables was assigned to a discussion on labor. Participants were then given the option of sitting at whatever table they wanted to talk about. Each table drew about 6 to 10 participants, all except for the labor one. That one had one person. It was me. No one was willing to engage me on a discussion on labor. Remember, this is a conference that had companies who are the most aware of sustainability, and yet no one wants to talk about labor. This isn't the first time I've seen this dynamic. I've been to a number of sustainability conferences over the last few years, and it's the same story at all of them. Companies are ready to talk about the environment because they see it as a cost savings for their business. But most of them do not want to talk about labor. And in discussions with them, I have found that there is a real denial about the labor situation here at home. A few companies, however, are breaking the silence. Companies like Costco and Bon Appetit and Andrews and Williamson, a grower in California. They are working with Oxfam and the United Farm Workers and others on a new project called the Equitable Food Initiative. EFI is a multi-stakeholder initiative. It's a collaboration of retailers, food service companies, unions, and NGOs, which would address labor issues in the United States at the farm level. I hope by next year's summit, all of you will be able to support this great project by buying EFI certified products in grocery stores where you can feel confident that the food you purchase has been grown under fair labor conditions. I'd like to finish my talk by telling you a quick story that happened to me a few weeks ago. I was on an exercise walk in Lexington, Massachusetts. Lexington is a middle-class to upper-class community outside of Boston, which is predominantly white. It was a beautiful day, and as I was walking through the center, lots of people were out in the center with their Starbucks coffee and food, Pete's coffee and food that they had bought from other nearby restaurants, enjoying the day. As I came around through the center, I decided to turn into a back alley to loop around, and I was startled to find 5 to 6 workers hiding in a stairwell of Latino descent. These were workers from the restaurants taking their mid-morning break. I was struck by the contrast. For too long now, many of us have obliviously enjoyed our food without any awareness for those that grow it, transport it, process it, or serve it. I couldn't help but feel that the time has come for those workers to come out of the dark shadows of the alley and into the light, where we can all acknowledge and appreciate the incredible service that they give in feeding our communities. Thank you.